When Shaquille O'Neal stopped to help his elderly neighbor, he thought it was just another act of kindness. But across the street, a woman saw something else, a threat. Within moments, 911 was dialed, cops arrived, and Shaq found himself at the center of a shocking confrontation. What she didn't realize, the whole world was watching, and this time, she had messed with the wrong man. Stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. It was a quiet morning in Meadowbrook Heights, a picturesque suburban town where houses had white picket fences, and the sidewalks were lined with tall, leafy oaks. The kind of neighborhood where everyone knew each other's routines, where the morning paper still landed on doorsteps, and where change, especially the kind that disrupted a long-held status quo, wasn't welcomed with open arms. At the heart of the neighborhood stood a house larger than the rest, a sprawling estate with a private driveway and a security gate. It wasn't ostentatious, just well-kept, elegant, and impossible to ignore. The man who owned it, however, was even harder to miss. Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq as some called him, wasn't just wealthy. He was larger than life in every way, physically towering over most, yet humble in spirit. Despite his status, he wasn't the type to live detached from the world. Every morning, just as the sun stretched over the rooftops, he'd step outside with a warm cup of coffee in one massive hand and a knowing smile on his face. He belonged to this neighborhood, not because of his money, but because of his heart. The kids adored him, their parents respected him, and the elders trusted him. Most of them, at least. Across the street, Mrs. Delaney, a frail woman in her 70s, struggled with her trash cans. It was the same routine every week, her small hands gripping the heavy plastic lids, her body barely able to manage the weight. Before she could even sigh in frustration, Shaq was already there, effortlessly lifting both cans like they weighed nothing. "Morning, Mrs. D," he greeted warmly. "Oh, Shaquille, you don't have to do that every time," she said, though her smile betrayed her words. "You say that, but we both know you'd fuss about your back later," he teased, placing the cans by the curb. "Can't let my favorite neighbor struggle." She chuckled, patting his arm. "Bless your heart, child. They don't make 'em like you anymore." But not everyone saw it that way. From her pristine porch a few houses down, Meredith Caldwell clutched her coffee mug a little too tightly. Her sharp blue eyes followed Shaq's every movement. Her lips pursed, her fingers tapping against the ceramic rim of her cup. To her, the image was unsettling. A black man, a massive black man, walking around a neighborhood like this, interacting freely, being comfortable. It didn't sit right with her. She had only moved in 6 months ago, but she had already formed her opinions. To Meredith, Meadowbrook Heights was supposed to be a certain kind of place. Her kind of place. And Shaq? He didn't fit. She wasn't alone in that sentiment. While most of the neighbors had grown to love Shaq, there were others who tolerated him at best. The whispers weren't loud, but they existed. Soft murmurs at backyard barbecues, fleeting glances exchanged in grocery store aisles. How does he even live here? Doesn't he have his own kind of neighborhood? I heard he's got cameras everywhere, probably paranoid. Shaq had learned to tune it out over the years. He wasn't naive. He knew racism when he saw it, even in its quieter forms. But he refused to let it shape his actions. He had nothing to prove. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, he stood on Mrs. Delaney's porch, fixing a broken wooden step. The old woman had nearly tripped that morning, and he wasn't about to let that happen again. His large hands moved with careful precision, hammering in new nails, reinforcing the frame. Meredith watched from her window, her phone gripped tightly. What is he doing now? To anyone else, it was obvious. He was helping. But to Meredith, the sight of him so close to an elderly white woman in distress set off alarm bells in her mind. She saw what she wanted to see. Something suspicious. Something dangerous. The next morning, Shaq was out early, unloading groceries from his car, when he noticed a few more sideways glances than usual. He could feel it. Something was off. Even Mrs. Delaney, who usually greeted him first, seemed distracted, clutching her purse tightly when she saw him. Then he saw it. A next-door post making its rounds online. Has anyone else noticed the strange man loitering around the older residents' homes? He doesn't seem to have a job and is always lurking. Stay vigilant, neighbors. A sinking feeling settled in his chest. He wasn't named in the post, but he didn't need to be. He knew exactly who it was about. Shaq had seen this before, the coded language, the subtle way people weaponize their discomfort. It wasn't the direct, burning racism of the past. It was the slow, creeping kind that came in whispers, side eyes, and online posts that incited paranoia. Still, he pushed through. He wouldn't let this change him. That evening, he was back at Mrs. Delaney's house, checking in like always. "Everything all right, Mrs. D?" he asked, his voice gentle but searching. She hesitated before nodding. "Of course, dear. Why do you ask?" He forced a smile. "Just checking in. You know me." But he could feel it. A shift, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. As he walked back toward his house, his instincts told him something was brewing. He could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken unease that lurked beneath the surface of this town. And sure enough, it wouldn't be long before the whispers turned into something far more dangerous. Because someone was watching, and someone was waiting. Meredith Caldwell had spent most of her life around people who looked, spoke, and thought exactly like her. Born into old money, she had never known a world where she wasn't catered to, where her presence wasn't met with nods of approval. Everything about Meadowbrook Heights appealed to her. The pristine streets, the uniformity of the homes, the carefully curated sameness of it all. It was a place where she belonged, or at least it had been, until she noticed him. Shaquille O'Neal was unlike anyone she had ever lived near before. He was big, in every sense of the word. His presence dominated the street. His deep laughter rumbled through the air. His car, a sleek, custom-made Rolls-Royce, shimmered under the streetlights. And his kindness? That was the part that unsettled her the most. Meredith was watching from her bay window the first time she saw him with Mrs. Delaney. He was carrying bags, heavy grocery bags, effortlessly up her porch steps. The old woman greeted him warmly, patting his arm like he was family. Meredith's brows furrowed. Her first thought wasn't admiration or curiosity. It was suspicion. What's he doing over there? Why is he always around her? She didn't know much about Shaq other than what the neighborhood murmured. He was wealthy, obviously. Some ex-athlete, maybe? Or a businessman. He had bought the largest house in the neighborhood, but unlike others who lived behind their gates, he was always outside. Too comfortable, too present. And the way the community responded to him confused her. People liked him. The kids adored him. He was invited to barbecues, called over to help with random repairs, and always seemed to be around Mrs. Delaney. That was what gnawed at her. Meredith had been raised to believe that people like him didn't interact with people like her unless they were hired to do so. He wasn't her gardener, her driver, or a worker of any kind. So what exactly was he doing? Then came the snowstorm. It was late December, and Meadowbrook Heights had been hit with an unexpected cold front. The streets were buried in thick layers of snow, and for the first time since moving in, Meredith found herself trapped. Her usual handyman was unreachable, and her driveway was frozen over. The next morning, she heard a steady scraping sound outside. When she peeked through the window, there he was again, Shaq. Not at her house, but across the street, clearing a path for Mrs. Delaney. No gloves, no coat, just a hoodie, sweatpants, and sneakers that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. Meredith's grip tightened around her coffee mug. Why is he doing this? The question played over and over in her mind. People like him didn't just help out of kindness. There was always a motive. And if no one else in the neighborhood saw it, then maybe she was the only one paying attention. That day, she started watching him more closely. She told herself it wasn't spying. It was vigilance. A necessary precaution. When Shaq walked outside, she noted what time it was. When he helped a neighbor, she watched from a distance. When he laughed, shook hands, or played basketball with the local kids, she kept mental tabs. It wasn't long before she convinced herself something was off. Then, one afternoon, it happened. She was outside pruning the roses in her front yard when Shaq pulled into his driveway. As he stepped out of his car, she saw something glint in his hand. Something small, metallic. Her breath caught. A weapon? Her body tensed. She stared harder, heart hammering. But as he moved, the object shifted into view. A set of house keys. Meredith exhaled sharply, realizing how quickly she had jumped to the worst conclusion. But the feeling didn't leave. She had never trusted her instincts more. Shaq was an outsider, no matter how much he smiled, no matter how many groceries he carried. And in Meredith's mind, outsiders had no business being that comfortable. The more she watched, the more convinced she became. She started taking photos, first from her window, then from her phone when she was out on walks. She'd linger a little longer in the grocery store when she saw him, memorizing his purchases, taking note of who he spoke to. Her paranoia grew dangerous. And then, one morning, she saw something she could no longer ignore. Shaq was standing on Mrs. Delaney's porch, lifting a heavy piece of furniture. The elderly woman was nearby, seemingly directing him, but to Meredith, it looked like she was struggling. Her breath quickened. This is it. This is what I was waiting for. Without thinking, she grabbed her phone. Her fingers dialed 911. Meredith Caldwell's heart pounded as she clutched her phone, her fingers tight around the edges like it was the last thing keeping her steady. She watched from her window, barely breathing, her eyes locked onto the massive figure standing on Mrs. Delaney's porch. Shaq. He was lifting something heavy, shifting it with ease. Too much ease. Mrs. Delaney stood beside him, small and frail, her arms moving as if she was protesting. But from where Meredith stood, it didn't look like a conversation. It looked like distress. This is it, she thought, pulse racing. This is what I was afraid of. Her mind spiraled. She imagined headlines, elderly woman attacked in broad daylight. She imagined herself explaining to the police why she didn't act sooner. She imagined Meadowbrook Heights turning into one of those neighborhoods, the kind she had deliberately moved away from. So she didn't hesitate. 911. The operator's voice came through. Calm, routine. 911, what's your emergency? Meredith's voice trembled, but she forced urgency into it. There's a man, a huge man. I don't know what he's doing, but he's on an elderly woman's porch and she looks uncomfortable. I think he might be harassing her. The words tumbled out in quick, uneven breaths. She knew better than to sound uncertain. Certainty got results. Can you describe the man? The operator asked. Meredith swallowed, gripping the phone tighter. He's black, really big. He looks dangerous. Please, you need to hurry. The operator's tone changed almost immediately. This was the kind of call that got priority. We're sending officers now. Stay on the line. Meredith nodded quickly, stepping back from the window as if she had just done something noble, something necessary. She had no idea what she had just set in motion. Shaq wiped the sweat from his forehead, stepping back to admire his work. The mahogany dresser sat perfectly in place in Mrs. Delaney's living room, no longer wobbling like it had before. That should do it, he said, smiling. Mrs. Delaney clapped her hands together, beaming. Oh, Shaquille, you're a lifesaver. I've been worried about that thing tipping over for weeks. Don't worry about it, Mrs. D, he chuckled, brushing off his hands. Now you won't have to break a hip trying to fix it yourself. She swatted at him playfully. You're too good to me. Shaq was about to respond when he heard sirens. His body tensed. Not the usual distant wail of a patrol car passing through town. These were getting closer. Fast. The sound grew louder, closer, angrier, until flashing lights painted the street in red and blue. 2 squad cars skidded to a stop right in front of Mrs. Delaney's house. Shaq's stomach dropped. What the hell? Before he could move, 3 uniformed officers stormed out, hands already on their holsters. Hey! One of them barked. Step away from the woman. Hands where we can see him. Shaq froze. Mrs. Delaney gasped. What on earth? Shaq knew better than to argue, knew how these situations went south if handled wrong. So he did as he was told. Slowly, carefully, he raised his hands, his towering frame stiffening under the weight of too many past stories that ended the wrong way. Sir, I don't know what this is about, but quiet, another officer snapped, stepping forward. We got a report of a possible disturbance involving an elderly resident. We need to secure the scene. A what? Shaq frowned. Man, I was just… Turn around, the first officer ordered. Now. Shaq's jaw clenched. A part of him wanted to protest, wanted to demand why he was being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood. But another part, the part that had seen too many headlines, too many funerals, too many names turned into hashtags, told him not to push it. So he turned. Mrs. Delaney was livid. You better not be thinking about arresting this man, she shouted, stepping forward despite the officer's attempts to keep her back. This is Shaquille O'Neal. Do you have any idea who you're harassing? The officers hesitated. One of them glanced at Shaq, really looking at him for the first time. Recognition flickered across his face. Wait a minute. Shaq? Shaq let out a slow breath. Yeah, man, Shaq. For a second there was silence. A crack in the aggression, a flicker of embarrassment. But the moment was short-lived, because just then, someone else stepped forward. And everything changed. Across the street, parked in a sleek black SUV, a man had been watching everything unfold. He had seen Meredith step back from her window. He had seen the police cars arrive. He had seen the way Shaq immediately became the suspect, no questions asked. And now, it was his turn to act. The car door swung open. A tall man in an impeccably tailored suit stepped onto the pavement, his expression unreadable. His presence alone commanded attention. The officers noticed him immediately, one of them stiffening. Sir, this is a… You don't want to finish that sentence, the man said coolly, cutting him off. His name was Jordan Remington, a media mogul, civil rights advocate, and one of the most influential men in the country. And more importantly, he had been recording everything. Jordan held up his phone. The screen was still lit, camera rolling. I just caught your little overreaction on video, he said, voice even but sharp. And unless you want this to be tonight's breaking news story, I suggest you start explaining why you've got Shaquille O'Neal standing here with his hands up like he just committed a crime. The color drained from the officers' faces. Shaq, still standing with his hands raised, turned his head slightly. Jordan. Here. The situation shifted in an instant. The officer who had been barking orders cleared his throat, suddenly uneasy. We received a report, he stammered. A neighbor called about a disturbance. Yeah? Jordan arched a brow. And did you bother to verify that before showing up like a damn SWAT team? Silence. Meredith, still watching from her window, felt a wave of panic crawl up her spine. This was not how she expected things to go. The officer stepped back, clearly scrambling for a way to de-escalate. Look, no harm done. It was a misunderstanding, he said, though the words felt thin. Shaq finally lowered his hands, flexing his fingers before turning toward Jordan. Man, what are you doing here? Jordan smirked. You know me. Always in the right place at the right time. His eyes flicked toward Meredith's house, as if sensing the watching eyes behind the curtains. You should probably find out who called this in, Jordan added, crossing his arms. Because the next time someone makes a false police report, they should probably expect consequences. The officers exchanged nervous glances. Shaq exhaled slowly, the tension still settling in his chest. He had been seconds away from becoming another statistic. And the worst part? It all started with a phone call that never should have been made. Meadowbrook Heights had always prided itself on being a quiet, orderly community. The kind of place where trouble didn't happen. Or at least, if it did, it wasn't discussed out loud. But today, that illusion shattered as police sirens wailed through the streets, their flashing red and blue lights bouncing off the pristine houses like a warning sign. Neighbors peered out from behind curtains and cracked doors. Some stepped onto their porches, their faces tight with unease. The tension in the air was suffocating, thick enough to choke on. 4 officers stepped out of their squad cars, their movements sharp, calculated, forceful. They weren't here for questions. They were here for control. And standing in the center of it all, Shaquille O'Neal, hands raised, perfectly still. He had felt this before. The weight of suspicion. The weight of being seen as a threat first, a man second. Even though he towered over every officer in front of him, he understood something terrifying. In this moment, they had all the power. Step away from the woman, the lead officer ordered. his voice cutting through the thick silence. His hand hovered near his holster, the stance of a man already expecting resistance. Shaq exhaled slowly. He didn't argue, didn't move. Behind him, Mrs. Delaney shoved past the officers, furious. "You listen to me right now," she snapped, pointing a shaky finger at the nearest cop. "What the hell do you think you're doing? That man has done nothing wrong." The officers hesitated, taken aback by the elderly woman's boldness. "Ma'am, please step back," one of them said, but his voice lacked the certainty it had a moment ago. Mrs. Delaney didn't back down. "I will not step back. This man has done more for this neighborhood than any of you ever have. You think just because someone calls you, you get to come storming in here, treating him like some criminal?" She turned to Shaq, placing a wrinkled hand on his massive forearm. Her touch was firm, unwavering. "You put those hands down, Shaquille," she ordered, her voice shaking with anger. "You are not a criminal, and I'll be damned if I let them treat you like one." For the first time, Shaq felt something shift. The officers were still standing tall, still gripping their belts, but the certainty in their postures was cracking. This wasn't playing out the way they expected. And then, the whispers started. The neighbors were talking now. Some murmured to each other, confused about what was happening. Others were recording. The weight of being watched settled onto the officers' shoulders, and suddenly, their actions felt less justified. One of them cleared his throat. "We received a report from a concerned citizen." "You mean Meredith Caldwell?" Mrs. Delaney cut in, eyes blazing. All eyes turned toward Meredith's house. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, her expression tight with defiance. She had watched the entire scene unfold, expecting to feel relief when the police arrived. Instead, she felt something colder, something unfamiliar. Doubt. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The police were supposed to arrest him, question him. The neighbors were supposed to be grateful. But now they were looking at her. Shaq, finally lowering his hands, turned his gaze toward her, his eyes calm but knowing. For the first time, Meredith felt like she was the one under scrutiny, and she hated it. "I did the right thing," she murmured under her breath, gripping the railing. "I did." But as the murmurs grew, as the weight of realization crept in, for the first time, she wasn't so sure. The tension in Meadowbrook Heights was thick enough to slice through. Shaq had finally lowered his hands, but the weight of the moment still pressed down on his broad shoulders. The officers, now aware of the growing audience, shifted uneasily. Their authority had been questioned. Their presence, once seen as law and order, now felt like an overreaction. But they weren't the only ones watching. Across the street, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows sat idly at the curb. It had been there since the beginning, silent, unmoving, unnoticed. Most had ignored it, assuming it belonged to a guest or a passerby. Inside, in the back seat, Jordan Remington watched through dark sunglasses, his expression unreadable. Jordan wasn't just anybody. He was a powerhouse, a media mogul, civil rights advocate, and one of the most influential voices in the country. His name carried weight in boardrooms, in courtrooms, and, most importantly, in the media. He had come to Meadowbrook Heights for a meeting with an investor. He hadn't planned on staying long. But then he saw the police cars. Jordan had been in this world long enough to know how these situations played out. A black man in a wealthy neighborhood. A frantic 911 call. A forceful police response. He knew this story. He had covered it too many times before. So without a word, he had pulled out his phone and started recording. He captured everything. Shaq with his hands up, the officers barking orders, Mrs. Delaney yelling in defense, the power dynamics, the assumptions, the shift in control. Jordan watched, waiting, knowing the exact moment when he would step in. Then, he saw it. One of the officers, the one who had been the most aggressive, reached out and placed a hand on Shaq's arm. It wasn't an arrest, not yet, but it was a push, a sign of force. Jordan had seen enough. The car door swung open. The moment he stepped out, everything changed. Shaq noticed him first. Even in the midst of the chaos, his sharp instincts picked up on the shift. A man in a tailored navy suit, polished dress shoes, and an aura of undeniable authority. Jordan's presence alone commanded attention. The officers turned toward him, their postures subtly changing. Recognition flickered in their eyes. The neighbors, those who had been whispering, watching from their porches, now leaned in closer, because they knew who he was. And more importantly, so did the police. Jordan didn't rush. He didn't need to. His steps were measured, precise. He held his phone up, making it very clear he was still recording. The lead officer cleared his throat. "Sir, this is an active situation." Jordan cut him off with a single raised hand. "Yes," he said smoothly. "It is." His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it. The kind of tone that didn't ask for power. It assumed it was already his. Jordan turned to Shaq, his expression unreadable. "You good?" Shaq exhaled, rolling his shoulders before nodding. "I'm good, man." Jordan's gaze flicked back to the officers. "You're going to tell me," he said, voice even, "that you got a 911 call about a disturbance and thought this was the appropriate response?" Silence. One officer shifted uncomfortably, another swallowed hard. Jordan took another slow step forward. "Because from where I'm standing, all I see is an unarmed man being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood." The words hung in the air like a loaded gun. The officer in charge tried to recover. "Sir, we were responding to a concerned citizen's report." Jordan smirked. "A concerned citizen?" He turned his head slightly, eyes landing on Meredith Caldwell's house. She froze. For the first time since this all started, she felt exposed. Jordan stared for a long moment, making sure she knew that he knew. Then, he turned back to the officers. "And tell me at any point during this response, did you bother to confirm the facts?" The lead officer clenched his jaw. "Sir, if you're looking to escalate..." Jordan let out a quiet laugh. It was cold, dangerous. "Escalate?" He shook his head. "No, officer. I don't need to escalate anything." Then he tilted his phone slightly, making sure the officer could see the screen. "Because I've been recording this entire time." The officer's face drained of color. The crowd murmured. The balance of control had tipped. This wasn't just another neighbor watching. This was Jordan Remington. The officers knew exactly what that meant. Jordan wasn't just a man with money, he was a man with influence. The kind of influence that turned local police incidents into national scandals. The lead officer swallowed hard. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said quickly. Jordan raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Do tell." The officer hesitated, glancing at his men before clearing his throat. "We were responding in good faith," he tried again. "No one is being detained. If Mr. O'Neal is free to go, then..." "Oh, he was always free to go," Jordan corrected. "The question is, what are you going to do about the false report that brought you here in the first place?" His words landed like a punch. One of the officers looked to the house, to Meredith. She stiffened. The realization was setting in. Her 911 call had been exposed. The officers had been called out. And now, the whole neighborhood knew it. Mrs. Delaney, still standing defiantly by Shaq's side, folded her arms. "I'd like to know that myself," she added. Jordan smiled faintly. "See, that's two of us." The officers hesitated. They knew they had messed up. The longer they stood there, the worse this would look. The lead officer exhaled sharply. "We'll be filing a report. We'll look into the situation." Jordan didn't let up. "And will the concerned citizen who wasted police resources be held accountable?" The officer hesitated. Too long. Jordan's smile didn't fade. "I'll take that as a no." He tapped his phone, saving the recording. "Don't worry. I'll make sure the right people see this." The lead officer tensed, but he didn't argue. Instead, he gave a curt nod and motioned to his team. "Let's move out." And just like that, the squad cars pulled away. As the last of the flashing lights disappeared down the street, the air felt different. Shaq rolled his shoulders, exhaling as the weight on his chest finally lifted. Jordan turned to him, sliding his phone into his pocket. "You good?" Shaq gave a small smirk. "Yeah, man. You always gotta make an entrance?" Jordan grinned. You know me. Mrs. Delaney huffed loudly, shaking her head. Whole damn situation was ridiculous. Shaquille, you know I'd have fought them myself if I had to. Shaq laughed. I don't doubt it, Mrs. D double quote. But as they spoke, as the tension finally started to settle, Meredith stood frozen on her porch. She had spent all this time watching Shaq. Now, the whole neighborhood was watching her. And for the first time in her life, she had no idea how to justify what she had done. Meredith Caldwell had spent years carefully curating her life, building a world where she was always in control. In her mind, she was a person who knew how things worked, who understood order, safety, and the right kind of people. But now everything was unraveling right in front of her. The moment the police cars disappeared, the neighborhood didn't go back to its usual quiet. It got louder. People weren't retreating into their homes. They were talking, whispering, pointing. And all of it was directed at her. She could feel it. The slow, creeping realization that she wasn't just a concerned neighbor who made a mistake. She was the reason this had happened. She wasn't the hero. She was the villain. And worst of all, Jordan Remington wasn't letting her slip away unnoticed. Jordan stood at the center of the street, his suit crisp, his phone still in his hand. The camera had stopped recording, but the damage was already done. He turned his head slightly, his eyes locking onto Meredith, and without hesitation, he started walking toward her house. Meredith stiffened. She wanted to move, to slip back inside and close the door on all of this. But her feet refused to budge. Jordan didn't knock. He didn't need to. He stopped at the bottom of her porch steps, his presence demanding attention. Meredith Caldwell, right? Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Jordan tilted his head, studying her. You recognize me, don't you? Of course she did. Jordan Remington wasn't just a businessman. He was on news panels, television debates, magazine covers. His face had been everywhere, pushing for racial justice, calling out systemic biases, dismantling the very assumptions she had built her life around. And now, he was standing on her lawn, addressing her like she was the one who had been caught doing something wrong. Meredith swallowed hard. I was just trying to do the right thing, she said, voice quieter than before. Jordan let out a sharp laugh. The right thing? He gestured back toward Shaq. What part of that looked like an emergency to you? Meredith's jaw clenched. I was concerned. He was moving things, and I thought Mrs. Delaney looked distressed. Jordan arched a brow. Did you ask her? Meredith hesitated. No, but did you think even for a second that maybe the black man in his own neighborhood wasn't a threat? A hush fell over the crowd. The neighbors were listening now. Jordan wasn't just talking to Meredith anymore. He was talking to all of them. Mrs. Delaney, who had been standing with Shaq, had had enough. She stormed across the street, her small frame practically vibrating with fury. You lied, she snapped at Meredith. Meredith flinched. I didn't lie. I misunderstood. You put in a false report. Mrs. Delaney cut her off, jabbing a finger in her direction. You saw Shaquille helping me, and your first instinct was to call the damn cops on him. What kind of person does that? The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A few of the neighbors nodded in agreement. Others avoided Meredith's gaze entirely. Because the truth was sinking in. They had all let this happen. Even those who hadn't actively distrusted Shaq had never spoken up when they saw the subtle looks, the whispers, the side comments at barbecues. They had let Meredith's paranoia turn into a police incident. And now, they all looked guilty by association. The officers, still lingering by their cars, were trying to remain professional, but it was clear they knew they had messed up. One of them, the lead officer who had first confronted Shaq, stepped forward cautiously. Look, no harm was done, he said carefully, his voice not nearly as forceful as before. It was a miscommunication. Miscommunication? Jordan repeated, turning his sharp gaze toward the officer. Number A miscommunication is when you accidentally send someone to the wrong address. This was racial profiling. The officer visibly tensed. Jordan took another step forward. Tell me, officer, if the 911 call had been about a white man helping an elderly neighbor, Would you have sent 2 squad cars with hands already on their guns? The officer's jaw clenched. We respond based on the urgency of the call. Uh-huh. Jordan smirked. And what exactly was urgent about a man carrying furniture? The crowd was watching now, waiting. The officer cleared his throat, shifting. Like I said, no harm was done. Jordan nodded, his expression unreadable. Then, he slowly lifted his phone again. So, if I send this footage to every major news outlet in the country, you're confident that's the message they'll take away? The officer went pale. Because this wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was about to be national news. Meredith stood on her porch, her mind racing. She had thought this would be a moment of victory, that she would be the one standing tall, validated in her concern. Instead, she was being exposed. And now, it wasn't just Jordan watching her. The neighbors, the same ones who had invited her over for dinner, who had smiled at her in the grocery store, were looking at her differently. Some were angry. Some looked disappointed. But the worst ones? The ones who wouldn't meet her eyes. Because she knew what that meant. They weren't just judging her. They were distancing themselves. This isn't how it was supposed to go. But it didn't matter anymore. Because as Jordan spoke again, the weight of what she had done finally hit her. This is the part where you apologize, he said, voice cool. The street was dead silent. Meredith opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Because for the first time in her life, she had no excuse. And now, everyone knew it. Somewhere in the crowd, a camera was already live streaming. The footage spread fast. Within minutes, news alerts began popping up across social media. Racial profiling incident in wealthy suburb, caught on camera. Shaquille O'Neal harassed by police in his own neighborhood. Jordan Remington confronts officers in viral clip. It was out of Meredith's hands now. She had spent her whole life controlling the narrative. But this was a story she couldn't rewrite. And the worst part? It wasn't over yet. Meredith Caldwell had never been a woman who feared consequences. Her entire life had been built on a foundation of entitlement, protection, and quiet privilege. A world where her actions were never truly questioned, just excused or explained away. But now, as she stood frozen on her porch, staring at the swirling storm of judgment around her, she realized something terrifying. This time, there would be no easy escape. Her name was already trending online. Her face, her words, her 911 call. Everything was out there now, twisted and dissected by the relentless churn of social media. And worse, people were digging. It didn't take long for the internet to do what it did best. Within hours, old stories surfaced. Comments from former colleagues. A college roommate who had never forgotten the casual slurs. Screenshots from neighborhood group chats, messages where Meredith had complained about certain people moving into the area. Even a petition she had quietly signed years ago to keep undesirables from buying homes in Meadowbrook Heights. It was all there. And now, the world was watching. At first, Meredith tried to rationalize it. People don't understand. I was just looking out for my neighborhood. But the narrative had already been written for her. She wasn't a concerned citizen. She was a racist, a liar. A woman who called the police on a black man for existing. She tried to fight back. She issued a statement, carefully worded, professionally crafted, meant to frame her as a misunderstood woman caught in a moment of bad judgment. But no one bought it. The media had moved past her excuses. The people she once called friends were distancing themselves. The local businesses she supported suddenly wanted nothing to do with her. She had become a pariah. And the worst part? It wasn't because she had been caught. It was because she couldn't control the fallout. Through all of this, Shaq remained calm. He had seen people like Meredith before. He had grown up knowing exactly how the world worked. And while he had every reason to be furious, to lash out, to drag her name through the mud like she had tried to do to him, he didn't. Because Shaq knew something Meredith didn't. Anger fades. But grace lasts forever. So when a reporter caught up with him outside his house, shoving a microphone in his face, waiting for him to condemn her, to call her out, he didn't. He just smiled, slow and measured, and said, "I don't hate her. I just hope she learns something from this." That was it. No outrage, no fire. Just a statement so simple, so undeniably powerful, that it immediately became the headline. Meadowbrook Heights had never been forced to look in the mirror before, and now, with the whole country watching, it was becoming impossible to ignore. Some neighbors sided with Shaq. They came to his house, apologized, promised to be better. They started organizing conversations about racial bias, making real efforts to change. But others? Others didn't see a problem. It was just a misunderstanding. This is getting blown out of proportion. Meredith isn't a racist. She just made a mistake. And just like that, the lines were drawn. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about who people really were when no one was looking. And for some, the truth was uglier than anyone expected. Days later, when the dust had barely begun to settle, Jordan Remington knocked on Shaq's door. Shaq answered with a knowing smirk. "Figured you'd be back." Jordan chuckled. "You know me, man. Always thinking ahead." He stepped inside, lowering his voice. "Look, the media's gonna ride this wave for a while. You have a chance here. Not just to clear your name, but to actually change the conversation." Shaq folded his arms. "What are you getting at?" Jordan handed him a folder. "National interview. Prime time. You speak your truth, unfiltered. No twisting the story, no one else controlling the narrative. Just you." Shaq stared at the folder, his fingers grazing the edge. For a moment, he considered it. Because this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every time a black man was accused of something just for existing. This was about all the Merediths in the world. He let out a slow breath, nodding. "Let's do it." And just like that, the real story was about to begin. The studio lights burned bright, reflecting off the polished wood of the interview set. The energy in the room was electric, every crew member knowing they were about to capture a moment that would be replayed for years to come. Shaquille O'Neal sat center stage, his massive frame dwarfing the sleek chair beneath him. But his presence wasn't just physical, it was emotional, powerful. Across from him sat Lena Whitmore, a renowned journalist known for her hard-hitting interviews. The cameras rolled, and the world leaned in to listen. Lena folded her hands, her voice measured but probing. "Shaq, let's get straight to it. Millions of people have seen the video of what happened to you. The 911 call, the police response, the confrontation with Meredith Caldwell. How do you feel knowing that your story has sparked a national conversation?" Shaq exhaled, rubbing his hands together before answering. "Honestly, it's tiring." Lena blinked. "Tiring?" Shaq nodded. "Because this isn't new. This isn't some wake-up call. This has been happening for years, decades, centuries. The only difference now? It was caught on camera." Silence. Shaq looked directly into the camera. Every black man in America knows that feeling. That moment when you realize that no matter how much money you make, how many lives you change, how many good things you do, somebody still sees you as a threat. His voice didn't rise, but the weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Lena leaned forward. "What would you say to the people defending Meredith Caldwell, the ones calling this an overreaction?" Shaq let out a slow breath. "I'd tell them to be honest with themselves." He tilted his head slightly, his eyes full of something deeper than anger, a quiet, steady truth. Meredith thought she was protecting her neighborhood, but from what? A man carrying furniture? A neighbor shoveling snow? If she had just walked outside and asked, she would have known the truth. But instead, she assumed the worst. He shook his head. That's the problem. Not just her, but a system that taught her to think that way. Lena let the words settle before asking, "And what do you want to happen next?" Shaq smiled, a tired, knowing smile. "I want people to stop acting shocked when this happens. I want folks to do the real work, to have the hard conversations, to look at themselves and ask, what biases am I holding on to?" He turned to the camera again. "And I want people like Meredith Caldwell to understand something. I don't hate you. I don't want to destroy you. I want you to learn. Because if we don't learn, nothing changes." The interview aired that night. By morning, it was everywhere. Clips flooded social media. Celebrities shared it. News channels replayed it on a loop. Listen to Shaq trended worldwide. Comment sections exploded. This is the kind of conversation we need. Shaq is showing more grace than most people deserve. No one's canceling Meredith. She canceled herself. This needs to be taught in every school. Even those who usually ignored these discussions couldn't look away. Because Shaq hadn't just called out one woman. He had called out a mindset, a history, a nation, and no one could pretend not to hear it. While the world dissected, debated, and discussed Shaq's words, Meredith Caldwell sat alone in her darkened living room, her laptop open in front of her. She didn't need to read the comments. She already knew what they said. She had lost everything. The Homeowners Association quietly removed her from the board. Her country club revoked her membership. Her husband, who had supported her at first, stopped defending her. Even the people who had once whispered about Shaq refused to be seen siding with her now. She had spent years building a life where she was untouchable. And now, she was completely exposed. For the first time, she was forced to sit with herself, to ask the questions she had spent her life avoiding. Why did I assume the worst? Why didn't I just talk to him? Would I have called 911 if he had been white? She had no answers. And that was the worst part. 1 week later, Meredith sat at her kitchen table, staring at the email. From Jordan Remington, subject. An invitation to listen. Her pulse quickened as she read. Jordan was hosting a town hall discussion on racial bias, featuring local leaders, activists, and Shaq himself. It would be televised, streamed, watched by millions. At the bottom of the email, in bold letters, was a personal message. You can keep running, or you can sit in the discomfort and learn. Your choice. Meredith swallowed hard. She had spent her entire life avoiding discomfort. But now she wasn't so sure she could ignore it anymore. And for the first time, she considered listening. Because Shaq hadn't destroyed her. He had given her a chance. And that was more powerful than any punishment. The moving trucks arrived before sunrise. There were no farewell parties, no tearful goodbyes from the neighbors, just silence, the kind that spoke volumes. Meredith Caldwell had lived in Meadowbrook Heights for nearly 7 years, but she left like a stranger. She had convinced herself that people would eventually move on, that time would smooth over her mistake. But the damage had already been done. She wasn't just the woman who called 911 on Shaq. She was the woman who had been exposed. And nothing in Meadowbrook Heights felt the same anymore. The morning was crisp, the kind of fall day where golden leaves danced across driveways, and the scent of fresh-cut grass lingered in the air. Meredith stood on her front porch one last time, looking at the street she once thought of as hers. Everything looked the same. The houses still had pristine lawns, kids still biked along the sidewalks, and wind chimes still hummed in the cool breeze. But the way people looked at her had changed. A few neighbors stood outside, pretending not to watch her go. Some exchanged glances, whispering under their breath. No one offered to help with the boxes. She had become a ghost before even leaving. Her husband had left a week ago, tired of the constant backlash and the way their once perfect social circle had crumbled. Their friends no longer invited them to dinner. Their favorite cafe stopped saving them their usual table. And the worst part? She couldn't even argue that it wasn't fair. Because deep down, she knew she had done this to herself. A final wave of shame washed over her as she stepped inside the moving truck, avoiding the stairs. This was her punishment. Not exile, not cancellation, but being forced to face herself. With Meredith gone, something subtle but undeniable shifted in Meadowbrook Heights. Conversations that had once been avoided now happened openly. A group of parents petitioned to introduce diversity and bias training in local schools. The Homeowners Association, once a quiet gatekeeper of unspoken discrimination, started welcoming a more diverse group of residents. The town's annual fall festival, which had always felt exclusive in an unspoken way, now saw a crowd that actually reflected the world outside the community. It wasn't a perfect transformation. There were still whispered conversations behind closed doors. Still people who clung to their biases, just better at hiding them now. But the difference was clear. People were learning. Because Shaq hadn't just called out injustice, he had set a new standard. And people were following. Despite everything, Shaq hadn't changed. He still started his mornings the same way, stepping outside with a cup of coffee, greeting the neighbors, offering help without hesitation. The only difference? People actually appreciated it now. One morning, he was helping a young couple unload furniture when he felt a familiar tug on his sleeve. "Shaquille, put that down." He turned, grinning as Mrs. Delaney stormed toward him, arms crossed. "You are not lifting that heavy thing with your bad knees," she scolded. Shaq laughed. "Mrs. D, my knees are fine." She huffed, placing her hands on her hips. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, dear. We already know who you are." Shaq's smile softened. They already knew. For years, he had tried to show that kindness wasn't a performance. It was just who he was. But now, for the first time, he didn't feel like he was proving himself. He felt accepted. A month after the interview, Jordan Remington called Shaq. "Have you seen the numbers?" Jordan asked. "Your speech, it's still trending, still making headlines." Shaq chuckled. "Didn't expect to go viral just for being decent." Jordan's voice turned serious. "It's more than that. People are listening. Schools are using your words to teach kids about bias. Police departments are revising training programs. Your story is making real change." Shaq exhaled, rubbing his chin. "Good. That's all I wanted." And he meant it. He hadn't set out to become a movement. He had just wanted to live his life without being treated like a suspect. But now, his story was bigger than him. And if it meant fewer people like Meredith jumping to the wrong conclusions in the future, then maybe, just maybe, this had all been worth it. One late afternoon, as the sun cast golden streaks across the rooftops, Shaq walked across the street to Mrs. Delaney's house, a warm apple pie in hand. The porch light flickered as she opened the door, eyes twinkling. "Back to bribing me with desserts, are we?" she teased. He grinned. "You know you love my apple pie, Mrs. D double quote." She chuckled, waving him inside. And just like that, everything felt normal again. Not forced, not performative, just genuine. Because at the end of the day, this had never been about proving a point. It had been about proving that kindness still mattered. And Shaquille O'Neal? He had never stopped believing that. The world kept moving. More news stories came and went. But Shaq's message never faded. His words continued to echo in classrooms, workplaces, and homes across America. Because his story wasn't just a moment, it was a lesson. One that would be remembered long after the headlines disappeared. And somewhere, in a new city, in a house far away from Meadowbrook Heights, Meredith Caldwell sat alone, still thinking. Because for the first time in her life, she was finally listening. What would you have done? That's the question this story leaves behind. Bias isn't always loud. It's in the quiet assumptions, the unspoken fears, the choices we don't even realize we're making. But now that you've seen it, what will you do differently? Change doesn't start with someone else. It starts with you.